Good morning, everyone. Today is Monday, and on Monday I remind you that the mission of the Masters, which is the wonderful title that I've given to the work I'm doing, because it certainly isn't mine, I'm working on their behalf, is supported by those of you who find benefit from it, the benefit being to awaken thy love in all hearts. And if you would like to contribute, you can join through Patreon, which is this wonderful website where creative people find people who want to help them be creative. My creativity is to change the world by changing consciousness. I think the whole thing is a bit grandly designed, but when I put my mind to it, I really had to say that's what we're doing. So you can donate regularly by signing up for Patreon. You can go to my website, which is called Asha Joy, if you'd like to make intermittent or one-time donations. And my friend Ishani, who manages the social media side of things, says, if you use my YouTube channel and become a subscriber, we're trying to push up to 10,000 subscribers, so you can help. Exactly what happens at that point, I'm not sure, but something very good. And the more subscribers we have, the more visibility we have. And since the intention is to awaken thy love in all hearts, then the more people and hearts we can touch, the better off we'll be. So I'd be very grateful if you'd consider those things. So now let us start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow at thy feet. Help us to feel your inner presence, to awaken with joy, to live with joy, to feel behind everything we are doing the ever-expanding vibration of thy love. We are your children, making our way through the wilderness of our own delusions, seeking thy light. Guide us, bless us, bring us to our divine home in thee. Om. Peace. Amen. We're working with this little booklet, Guidelines for Conduct of Members of the Ananda Sevaka Order. Because I want to broaden the understanding here, we're calling it simply the Ananda Way of Life. And there's 16 articles in this book. You can see it's just a tiny pamphlet. And we're up to article number 3, which is called Spiritual Practices. And what we've worked with so far is what is Ananda and what does it mean to live in community. What does it mean to live in community is one of the more powerful chapters here, and it's the second. First, Swami talks about what is Ananda. Then he talks, what does it mean to live in community? People have a sort of foggy idea of it, but they don't unless you have some kind of experience of it, you don't necessarily realize what the real parameters are. So now we're moving from that into what are the spiritual practices that define the Ananda Way of Life. The Sevaka order is something, as I said at the introduction to this whole series, is a monastic order within the residential communities of Ananda that we created together in the early 80s. Swami decided to formalize it. And it's like the funnel, so to speak, of what it means to be a spiritual person is very broad in its total definition. I mean, we are all, every living creature, every sentient being is a manifestation of Satchidananda. There's actually another pamphlet that I've also spoke about probably a year ago. It was called The Way of the Ananda Sangi. And in that, Swami Kriyananda defines also the broadest concept of what we're doing, which is the reality of Satchidananda, which means ever existing ever conscious, ever new bliss. And it's the best word for God that I think that there is, Satchitananda. And in that, Swami defines everything in creation is a manifestation of Satchitananda. The purpose of our individual lives is to become ever more aware of that inner reality. And then that's the wide funnel in which everything in the universe is swept in. And then as an individual gets more and more serious about their spiritual path, the definition and the opportunity becomes more and more defined. So by the time one becomes a member of the Ananda Sevaka order, one's spiritual practices have become exceedingly defined because there is a divine law. It's not a matter of opinion. It's a divine law that you have to concentrate and you have to go deep in one place if you're going to actually transform the consciousness. The ego, by definition, is restless. It likes to be stimulated. It likes to be inspired from the outside. And that's precisely what we're fighting against, is the necessity to come closer and closer to divine stillness. And there's a little bit of confusion that often sets in people's minds. Well, if all paths lead to the same goal, if all masters have the same state of consciousness, then I should follow all masters. And it's a little bit like a very unfaithful person says, well, I want to love everybody. Why should I just be loyal to one man or to one woman? After all, we should love everybody. And it sounds good on paper, but when you sort of try to live it out, it doesn't work as well as you think. There was a community, I think it still exists, but it's not as prominent as it was then. Back in the 70s when Ananda was starting, it was called The Farm, and it's in Tennessee, and I believe it's still there. The founder of that community, his name is Stephen Gaskin, and his partner is Ainu May Gaskin. And Stephen was a university professor of English actually, but he affected a rather folksy manner, and he was a real hippie guru is the only way to call him. But he was the real deal, despite his sort of unusual manner, and he and Swami Kriyananda really liked each other. And Stephen used to do these meetings in San Francisco, I don't know, the Wednesday night or Thursday night meetings, and he attracted many, many hundreds of followers, and he was very charismatic. And he wasn't orthodox in spirituality as we were, but he was the real deal. And I sort of smile when I say that, because that's how he praised Swami Kriyananda. Swami Kriyananda is the real deal, that's what he said. So I always like to hand it back to Stephen. So at one point, Stephen and his crew all had school buses that they lived in, and they caravanned across the country and went to Tennessee and formed this farm. So it was all part of the radical reinvention of morality in the 70s that I dropped out of very early, but I started early and then dropped out of being dropped out very early and went to Ananda. But they were reinventing marriage and all relationships between all sexual relationships and sexual behavior, to the horror of a great many facets of society, but nonetheless, that's what happened. So among the things that they did, this is a very long introduction, among the things that they did was they had group marriage. They just were going to throw everything away, and monogamy was one of the things they threw out the window. So you were sort of kind of married to anybody you felt like being married to for as long as you wanted to, and then you would just move on to some other reality. I was never part of it, so I don't know what it was. But after a time, they abandoned it. They abandoned that practice. And Stephen was being interviewed by somebody at one of the conferences that he was at. And they said, well, I understand that you were experimenting with radical social systems and you had a group marriage system, but you don't have it anymore. Why don't you have it anymore? And Stephen said, it don't work. In his affected bad grammar, it don't work, he said, just like that. And it don't work spiritually either. That's really the whole point of what I was going to try to say, because it's not the way we're made. And the reason it don't work is because it's not the way we're made. We have a desire for loyalty, we have a desire for intimacy, we have a desire for trust. And you can sort of say, I can just spread that out easily, but it don't work. And what happens to us spiritually is that we date for a while. We shop around. We get to know what spiritual paths are like. We get to sort of see a lot of different expressions of Satchidananda, many of which, not all, but most of which are very valid, or at least they're valid on the level that they exist. That's really what I mean to say. Not all spiritual opportunities are inspired by self-realized masters. Some are inspired by advanced souls who also are very, very true to what they present. Some of them are just somebody's idea, and some of them don't work. But that's beside the point. That's what we find out. But then there comes this time where there's just a longing for something much deeper. And from our own experience, we begin to have this wanting something more. And when a person is to think of human life again, in a promiscuous, licentious period of their life where they're just exploring every possibility, when someone says that to them, it makes no sense to them. But there will come a point, there often comes a point later, after whatever the karmic period is, where we just want something else. And that's what happens to us spiritually. We don't have to go and try to force it, but we have to have an open mind, and above all, we have to be honest about our experience. We have to be honest about our experience. That's the whole key. When Swamiji was asked about many of the radical things that happened in the 60s, he said on one level he approved, which is an odd thing for an Orthodox monk to say, because people were making experience the criteria for their life decisions. And he said, and that's essential. You can't just make dogma your criteria, and most of all, you can't make fear your criteria. You have to make your experience. He said, but then you have to be honest about your experience. You can't just constantly impose on your experience your preconceived idea of what the experiment's supposed to show. You have to actually be conducting the experiment. And so it happens, and those of us who are members, life members of this Sevaka order, of which I am one, it's because I want to be committed. It's because I recognize that commitment and steady practice and an effort to attune myself to one ray of grace is not in any way to disparage countless other rays of grace. It's just this one is mine. It's just like that. As Swami said, there can be many wonderful mothers in the world, but one of them is my mother. And that intimacy and that closeness and that commitment has a unique power. And so one of the things that's very interesting, as it happened yesterday, I met a young man at our Sunday satsang who was there for the first time. He was just getting to know Ananda in various ways, and he was, in the mood of, but I like this, but I like this, but I like that. Great. I said, the doors of Ananda are wide open, and everybody is welcome everywhere, except for a very few things. There comes a point where a few experiences are limited to those who've made a commitment. And because we have to have a place where we can be free with each other. And certain things also, you need a certain attitude. Your right attitude is part of what makes the technique work. It's not just a technique in a vacuum. It exists in the context of commitment. And so those doors are closed. But it was the same thing. It's like, be true to your experience, whatever you're actually experiencing. But those of us who have found that, you recognize again from your experience. I was very fortunate. Well, no, I did shop for a while. That's not true. I've learned about self-realization just before I was 19, and I met Swami when I was 22. And during those 3 years, I was quite avid. At that time, the East-West Bookshop, which, as it happens, Ananda now owns and runs, this would have been in the 60s, the late 60s. And there was no internet, so bookstores were where you found truth. And one of the best in the world was right here in this area where I also lived at that time. And I would go to that bookstore, and I just started reading across the shelf of saints. Because once I got the basic principles in my mind, I really wanted to know how people did this. Because I could feel it was a totally radical change that was being suggested. And I believed right from the start, because the first books that I read were by Ramakrishna, about Ramakrishna and by his disciple Vivekananda, which is a very, very high-level teaching. Ramakrishna was an avatar. And it's a very high-level teaching, and I thank God that that was how I started. But I couldn't figure out what to do, because now I had this tremendously radical idea about what the purpose of life was, but my life still looked just the same. I couldn't make my life change. And so I started reading about all these saints, but they were in Catholic monasteries. They lived centuries ago. They were in mission fields somewhere in Africa. They were medical missionaries to danger zones, or they were Tibetan yogis in caves, or Buddhist monks. And I was just just a young gal, a sort of retired hippie, and living in Palo Alto, and I couldn't put it together. But I could feel in myself that I needed a place that I could commit myself to completely that would not disappoint me. Of course, that's the other part of it. One has this little fear, especially if you're an American, where not being gullible is a really high value. The last thing you ever want to be seen as is not being shrewd. It's a funny value, but that's one that we have. It makes us astute as a culture, but it also shuts a lot of doors that would be nicer to keep open. But we're all working on it. We're good people. Everybody's good people. We just have different cycles. But when I met Swami Kriyananda, that was the mood I was in. And when I saw Swami, literally when I saw him before he spoke, I could tell he was actually living it. He was doing it. He wasn't just going to talk about it. He was the real deal. and I just wanted to walk in his footsteps, because I could tell he had blazed a path. And so what I was going to say is, when you're trying to figure out sort of where do I belong, it's not always so easy to evaluate the teaching or the teacher, because some of it is just blows your mind, is the phrase. Since I'm back in the 60s, those were the words that we would use. It just blows your mind, and you don't have a context in which to understand it. I was in India, in Badrinath, which is one of the holiest places in India. I have the pleasure of the company of friends of mine who run our Ananda Center in Delhi, Daya and Keshava, and we were just reminiscing really about all the places we've traveled in India and all the holy places there are. And we were talking about this sadhu that we met in Badrinath, this wonderful temple there. And let's see now, what was I going to say? Just a moment, I lost the purpose of why I brought it up. Well, the exact purpose I'll finish since I started saying it. He talked to us about how during the winter time, he would enter this metal box, put his body into a state of suspended animation. He lived so high in the Himalayas that many, many feet of snow buried his cabin and his box. And he would put himself into a state of suspended animation. And then he would, in his astral body, he would spend the winter months with Babaji in India, in the higher Himalayas. And I didn't know what to think about this at all. I was in this little cabin with him, with a group of people. And he was just telling us this story in such a casual way. And I was in this little kutir looking up at the Himalayan mountains, and later Swamiji asked me what was my impression of the man. I said, "Sir, there was so much going on at that moment. I don't know what I was feeling." I mean, I was tremendously transported into another realm, but I don't know whether it was his consciousness, my own past life memories, the whole setting, I couldn't possibly say. But what Swamiji, I made the comment to Swami that he talked about, doing this thing that seemed so unusual, like going into the suspended animation and sitting in the box and letting the snow cover him and all of this. And then being with Babaji, he said, and he just talked about it as if it was just perfectly natural. There was no, sort of awe in his voice. He just said that. Then, I'm going to go to the grocery store and bring back 2 bags of apples, and he's going to go into the box and then go to the Himalayas and be with Babaji. It just had about the same. It wasn't that he wasn't respectful about it. It was just perfectly natural to him. And I presented that as a question mark. And Swami's answer, I'll never forget, it was perfect. He said, "Oh, but at some point in your evolution, it is perfectly natural. It doesn't require any wild statements about it. It's just perfectly natural." When Swamiji went to visit Satya Sai Baba, which he would have gone, probably would have been in the early 70s, maybe it was even 1972 when he went there. But Satya Sai Baba would materialize things with his hands, just like this. He would just, "Oh, here, let me give you a mala." And he would just, turn his hand over and there would be a mala in his hand. And Swamiji was close enough to him to see that he wasn't reaching in a pocket, it wasn't sleight of hand, it just wasn't there, and then it was. The laws of how you can do that are even explained in Autobiography of a Yogi. But for most people, we can't operate those laws. But he gave Swamiji a crystal mala, which Swamiji wore for a long time. There's, in my book, Light Bearer, about Swamiji, one of the early pictures of Swami with very bright, like probably 72 or 73. You can see under his shirt this crystal mala. And it was manifested for him like that with Satya Sai Baba. And Swami said, one of the things that was so notable about the way Sai Baba did that is that it was just perfectly natural. He didn't make the slightest show about it. He just turned over his hand or created vibhuti, which is the sacred ash, whatever, just like that. Because at a certain point, it's natural to do it. And when I met Swami Kriyananda, and he was just simply doing so naturally and spontaneously everything that I wanted to do. He had a purpose to his life. He was creative in the way he was applying himself to it. He was serving humanity with a cause that he deeply believed in, and that was just it was so attractive to me, and this is what I was going to say also earlier. It's very hard sometimes to evaluate the teacher or the teaching because we don't have the wherewithal. When I was there with that man who at that time was called Boxwala, because he was in a box, during the winter, Boxwala Baba is what he was called, the one who stays in the box. But I had no way of evaluating it. There was no way, I couldn't even begin. His life I could understand. I could understand living in that little kutir, living up in the mountains, separating yourself from the culture and the world. That was not hard for me to understand. That seemed natural to me. But getting in that box for the winter months, I didn't know what to do with that. But so coming back to, let me just find this. So, oh yes. So when you're trying to understand the teacher, sometimes we just don't have the wherewithal, or even the teaching, and we're going to, you learn certain ways of meditating, certain ways of visualizing, ways of praying, things you may do with your breath, you may do with your body. Unless you have a certain kind of karma, it doesn't necessarily put you in a state of cosmic consciousness the first time you try it. Sometimes it puts you in a great state of tension and confusion because, just like I've lived my whole life like this, and all of a sudden I'm supposed to live it turning inward. I mean, you just kind of cross your eyes and you don't know what you're doing. So one of the most effective ways to tell if a path belongs to you is to look at the people who follow it, especially those who follow it with great integrity. And of course, there's a certain amount of intuition here. Time is a factor, those who've been on the path for a very long time. But it's something deeper. It's a sincerity and a clarity in the eyes and a simplicity of intention. And what their vibration is really what that path is. Because this is who you will become. You will become, if you follow this path with the same dedication, you'll become like them. And when I met Swamiji, I had actually never read Autobiography of a Yogi, the master's book that is the defining, it's the front door generally to getting on this path. I hadn't read it. I owned it. I had started to read it, but I was a bit of a snob, I think is the actual word. I was a bit of an intellectual snob about the spiritual path, and Master's book is so full of devotion, and on page 9, I believe it is, Lahiri Mahashaya materializes in a wheat field. He's one of the gurus, and he materializes in the wheat field to scold Master's father for being too harsh on his devotee and not allowing the devotee to come see his guru. And, I've thought that miracles and phenomenal things were a distraction on the spiritual path, that we should just be pure. I was really skinny, and I had these little cat glasses, and I was just sort of shriveled. That's the only word I can think of. Later, when we learned the word brahmacharini, sometimes I called myself raisinarini because I just felt like I was just so compressed. My friend Seva was prunamata and I was raisinarini. That's what we call ourselves on our bad days. So funny. Anyway, so I hadn't been able to read Autobiography of a Yogi because Master was beyond me to understand. Vivekananda's book that I read was very, very wonderful, absolutely marvelous, but more intellectual and not at all. Nobody materialized in wheat fields in his book. Vivekananda specifically actually did not talk about those things because he felt Americans and Westerners wouldn't understand. He had those experiences, but he didn't talk about them. I can't help, now that I'm talking about raisinarini, I have to remember, let me finish my thought, and then I'll finish with a silly story. But when I saw Swami, and this is actually literally, he walked into the room, and an intuition I didn't know I had said, he has what I want. He was a follower of Master of Yogananda. He followed, and I never got to Article 2, but he followed these spiritual practices, and he was everything I wanted to be. And I still didn't know anything about Master. I didn't read Autobiography. I did go back and read it and loved it, but I recognized in him my personal aspiration. And in that time, it was 1969, the sort of accoutrements of his position, he kept them all at bay. So he was very natural and approachable, and he was 44. So he was also, quite young and just completely at ease and very much like everyone around him. Although he was completely not like anyone around him, he had no borders to his consciousness. That's what I saw. Now, I'm going to just tell you about how I stopped being such a raisin. I was very, very fanatical about my diet, a food fanatic. I ended up running the kitchen. I couldn't cook, but I could be fanatical about food. it was an unfortunate combination for the people who had to eat what I cooked, but we worked our way through that. I came to Ananda on June 1st. Just a few days ago, I had my 50th anniversary. And that summer, I went with Swami to town. Town was Nevada City, and from Ananda Village. And I went with him with a group of people. It must have been, well, maybe 2 cars of us, I guess. I don't remember why we went to town, but we did. We had no access to anything out of the village. There was no market at that time. So going to town was like this, a big adventure because you got to do stuff. And one of the things that Swami always did was he stopped at Swenson's ice cream parlor, because we didn't have ice cream. We didn't have access to ice cream, and most of us didn't have refrigerators, so you couldn't really take it home. So we sat at this table, and this is where I think there was a fairly large crowd of us. Swami sat at the head of the table, and just by chance I sat at the foot of the table, so I could just see him like this. I had not eaten sugar in maybe 5 years, and I thought I was pretty close to cosmic consciousness. This was the relationship in my mind. And here we are, Swami, who that's why I came to Ananda, was to be with Swami, and Swami's taking me to an ice cream parlor. So I went along, but cooperate with the program was not part of what I was doing. And they all sat around the table with these, big colorful menus of all the sundaes, and the enthusiasm, now in my mind it's greatly exaggerated, but the enthusiasm was like some sort of wild movie, where everybody's doing things like this, and they're talking about the different toppings and the different ice creams and all the different ways, and everybody ordered some, massive ice cream thing. And I asked for a glass of water, no ice, please. So their ice cream comes like this, and everybody's reaching across the table with their spoons and trying this one and trying that one, and Swami's right in the middle of this whole thing. And I'm sitting there drinking my water, no ice, thank you. Just looking. But by the grace of God, I had the sense to realize that it wasn't they, but it was I who somehow was out of step. You see, that could have gone just the opposite, but it didn't. By the grace of God, it occurred to me that Swami had what I wanted, and if he was going to get it through ice cream, then maybe I should reconsider the concept of ice cream. And the rest is history, thank you, God. And I thank God for that every day. Okay, my friends, God bless you.